On the morning of May 1st, 1943, Korvettenkapitän Werner Henke stood on the conning tower of U-515, watching the horizon through Zeiss binoculars. The submarine was surfaced 400 nautical miles west of Freetown, Sierra Leone. The equatorial sun was already brutal at 0800 hours. Henke had been at sea for 31 days. His patrol had been extraordinarily successful. Between February 19th and April 30th, he had attacked Convoy TS-37 off West Africa. In 12 hours, using the new magnetic influence detonators, he had sunk 7 merchant ships totaling over 43,000 tons. It was one of the most devastating single convoy attacks of the entire war. For that patrol, Henke would receive the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. But something during that attack had troubled him. Something he couldn't explain. On the night of April 30th, while prosecuting his 7th target, a British escort destroyer had appeared without warning. Henke's Metox radar warning receiver should have detected British radar at ranges up to 15 kilometers. It had always worked before. The Metox was supposed to give U-boat commanders. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Enough warning to dive before aircraft or surface vessels could close to attack range. This time, the receiver had remained completely silent until the destroyer was close enough to open fire with its 4.7-inch guns. Henke had ordered an emergency crash dive. U-515 went deep at full speed, hull groaning under the strain. Depth charges followed, but they were poorly aimed. The boat survived. When Henke surfaced 3 hours later, he noted the incident in his patrol log. Allied radar seemed to be operating on frequencies the Metox couldn't detect. When U-515 returned to the submarine base at Lorient, France, on May 4th, engineering staff examined the Metox receiver. They found nothing wrong. The unit was functioning normally. It could detect the 1.5-meter wavelength radar the British had been using for 2 years. The engineers concluded that either the destroyer hadn't been using radar or Henke's operator had missed the warning signal during the confusion of combat. The official explanation was operator error under high-stress conditions. Henke didn't believe it. His Metox operator was experienced, reliable, calm, under fire. But he had no evidence to dispute the engineer's conclusion. The receiver worked perfectly during bench tests. There was no malfunction to document. Henke filed his report and prepared for his next patrol. What Henke didn't know was that on March 17, 1943, British Coastal Command had deployed the first operational ASV Mark III radar on a Wellington bomber. The system operated on 10-centimeter wavelength, generated by a cavity magnetron. It could detect a surfaced U-boat at 16 kilometers. It could detect a submarine's periscope at 8 kilometers. And the Metox receiver every U-boat carried was completely blind to it. By the first week of May 1943, German U-boat operations were approaching their peak effectiveness. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding U-boat operations from headquarters in Paris, had 240 operational submarines. 118 were at sea. German shipyards were producing 20 U-boats per month. Losses before May averaged fewer than 10 boats monthly. The mathematics favored Germany. In March 1943, U-boats had sunk 82 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic, totaling 476,000 tons. It was the worst month of the war for Allied shipping losses. British officials were privately discussing whether they could continue the war if the losses continued at that rate. Fuel reserves were down to 3 months. Food stockpiles were at emergency levels. Winston Churchill himself would later admit that the U-boat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The U-boat force had never been stronger. Experienced commanders like Werner Henke, Reinhard Heydrich, Erich Topp, and Otto Kretschmer had developed tactics that seemed unstoppable. German submarines operated on the surface at night, invisible to British radar, faster than most escort ships, able to position themselves ahead of convoys and strike from darkness. For 3 years, this tactical doctrine had dominated the Atlantic. U-boats had sunk over 2,000 Allied merchant ships. They had killed 30,000 merchant seamen. They had come within weeks of cutting Britain's supply lines completely. But in the first week of May, 1943, something fundamental changed. On May 4th, the same day Henke returned to Leone, Admiral Dönitz received intelligence reports about Convoy ONS-5. The convoy consisted of 43 merchant ships traveling from Liverpool to Halifax. British routing had taken them through waters where Dönitz had positioned 2 wolf packs, Star and Fink. Together, these groups comprised 43 U-boats, one of the largest concentrations of submarines deployed against a single convoy in the entire war. For the U-boat commanders, this should have been a massacre. 43 submarines against 16 escort vessels. The mathematics were overwhelming. Dönitz expected to sink at least 20 merchant ships, possibly 30. Such losses would cripple Allied morale and demonstrate that Germany still controlled the Atlantic. The convoy battle for ONS-5 opened on April 28th when U-650 spotted the merchant ships 400 nautical miles south of Greenland. Over the next 6 days, waves of U-boats attacked repeatedly. They sank 13 merchant ships. But the cost was catastrophic. 6 submarines were destroyed. 7 more were damaged so badly they had to abort their patrols and return to base. 13 U-boats out of 43. Nearly 30% casualties. For German U-boat operations, which had always maintained kill ratios heavily in their favor, this was unprecedented. In previous convoy battles, Germany typically lost 1 or 2 boats while sinking 15 to 20 merchants. The ratio had always favored the submarines. At ONS-5, the ratio had reversed. Dönitz studied the action reports with growing unease. The commanders who survived described attacks that made no sense. British escort destroyers were appearing with impossible accuracy. Aircraft were finding surfaced U-boats at night in conditions where visual detection should have been impossible. Depth charge attacks were becoming more precise even when submarines took evasive maneuvers. The pattern was unmistakable. Allied detection capability had improved dramatically, but German intelligence had no information about how. Korvettenkapitän Erich Topp, one of Germany's top aces, with 35 ships sunk, had retired from active patrol duty in September 1942 to command a training flotilla. But he stayed in contact with operational commanders and heard their reports. The stories were consistent and disturbing. U-boats were being caught on the surface at night by aircraft that appeared without Metox warning. Escorts were tracking submarines through evasive maneuvers with accuracy that seemed impossible. Experienced commanders who had survived dozens of patrols were being sunk on their first mission in weeks. The debriefing officers at U-boat headquarters collected these reports systematically. By early May 1943, they had documented 17 separate incidents where commanders reported Allied detection without Metox warning. The data was clear. Something had fundamentally changed in Allied detection capability. But what? German intelligence had no information about any new British radar system. Radio intercepts gave no indication of technological breakthrough. Captured equipment from downed aircraft showed only the familiar 1.5-meter radar systems. Agents in Britain reported nothing unusual. Interrogations of captured Allied aircrews revealed nothing beyond standard operational procedures. The German naval staff faced a problem they couldn't solve with available information. Either the Metox receivers were failing in ways that couldn't be detected during testing, or the British had developed a completely new radar system that German engineers said was technically impossible. The staff at U-boat headquarters chose to believe the receivers were failing. The alternative was too disturbing to accept. If the British had actually developed operational centimetric radar operating on wavelengths shorter than 1 meter, it meant German radar research was years behind Allied capabilities. It meant the fundamental assumptions guiding German naval technology were wrong. It meant every tactical doctrine developed over 3 years of successful operations was suddenly obsolete. That was too large a paradigm shift to accept based on incomplete evidence and speculation. German engineers had concluded in 1940 that centimetric wavelengths were impractical for operational radar. Power output was too low, detection range was too short, components were too unreliable for use aboard aircraft or ships. British engineers must have reached the same conclusions. The laws of physics didn't change based on nationality. If German research said centimetric radar was impossible, it was impossible. The intelligence staff proceeded from that assumption. If centimetric radar didn't exist, then the Metox receivers must be failing. In some way, German technicians couldn't diagnose. Or perhaps Allied detection methods had improved through better training, better tactics, better coordination between aircraft and surface vessels. These explanations were plausible. They fit existing knowledge. They didn't require accepting that German technology was fundamentally inferior. On May 6th, Convoy SC-129 came under attack in the North Atlantic. 17 U-boats converged on the convoy. They managed to sink only 3 merchant ships. 2 submarines were destroyed. 4 more were so severely damaged they had to abort and return to base. 6 U-boats lost out of 17. 35% casualties, for 3 merchant ships sunk. The kill ratio was catastrophic. Admiral Dönitz ordered immediate analysis of the engagement. The commanders who survived reported the same pattern. Allied escorts seemed to know exactly where U-boats were positioned. Aircraft appeared from darkness with no warning. Depth charge patterns were unnaturally accurate. One commander, Captain Lieutenant Ulrich Folkers of U-125, reported that a British aircraft had appeared directly overhead at night in heavy cloud cover. Folkers had been running on the surface to recharge batteries. The Metox receiver had been operating normally, scanning continuously for British radar. The receiver had remained silent until the aircraft was less than 1 kilometer away. At that range, there was no time to dive. Folkers had ordered his anti-aircraft crew to engage, but the aircraft had already dropped 4 depth charges. They exploded close alongside, rupturing fuel tanks and damaging the pressure hull. U-125 survived, but barely. Folkers had been forced to surface immediately and run for France on diesel engines, with pumps working continuously to keep the boat from sinking. When U-125 reached Lorient on May 10th, engineering staff examined the damage. The pressure hull had buckled in 3 places. 1 diesel engine was destroyed. Both electric motors were damaged. The boat would be in yard repairs for at least 3 months. The examining engineers also tested the Metox receiver. It worked perfectly. During bench tests, it detected British 1.5-meter radar at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. There was no malfunction, no degraded performance, no explanation for why it had failed to warn Folkers of the attacking aircraft. The official conclusion was the same as before. Operator error during high-stress combat conditions, but experienced U-boat commanders knew their Metox operators. These were trained professionals who had survived multiple patrols. They knew their equipment. They followed procedures. They didn't make elementary mistakes. The pattern suggested something else, something the engineers and intelligence staff weren't willing to accept. What none of them knew was that, by early May 1943, British Coastal Command had equipped over 40 aircraft with ASV Mark III radar. American forces had deployed similar systems on maritime patrol aircraft operating from bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, and Northern Ireland. Allied anti-submarine forces had achieved complete technological surprise. German U-boats were being hunted by radar they couldn't detect, using technology German engineers had declared impossible. The cavity magnetron that made ASV Mark III possible had been invented in February 1940 by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham. It solved a problem engineers had struggled with for years. Previous vacuum tubes couldn't generate sufficient power at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters. The magnetron used resonant cavities machined into a solid copper block to create powerful microwave oscillations. The first prototype generated 400 watts at 10 centimeter wavelength. That was 50 times more powerful than any previous microwave source. By June 1940, General Electric Company had produced sealed cavity magnetrons suitable for aircraft use. These production units could generate peak power of 10 kilowatts in short pulses. That was enough to build radar systems with detection ranges measured in tens of kilometers. The magnetron weighed 400 grams. It was a copper cylinder, 8 centimeters in diameter and 6 centimeters tall. Inside were 8 resonant cavities arranged around a central cathode. When energized, electrons spiraled around the cathode in a magnetic field. As the electrons passed each cavity opening, they stimulated microwave oscillations that synchronized to produce coherent output at 3000 megahertz. The complete ASV Mark III system included the magnetron transmitter, a rotating antenna, a receiver unit, 2 cathode ray tube displays, and power supplies. Total weight was 90 kilograms. It required a dedicated operator, watching displays and calling out target contacts to the pilot. The system was mechanically complex and required constant maintenance. Magnetrons had limited operational life, typically 40 to 60 hours before requiring replacement. The rotating antenna mechanism jammed in humid conditions. Cathode ray tubes failed from vibration. Coastal command ground. Crews spent more time repairing ASV Mark III than any other airborne equipment. But when it worked, it transformed anti-submarine warfare. An aircraft with ASV Mark III could patrol at night or in heavy weather and detect surfaced U-boats at ranges where visual detection was impossible. The submarine had no warning until the aircraft was within 1 kilometer. By that time, escape was impossible. A surfaced submarine needed 30 seconds to crash dive to safe depth. Aircraft could close 1 kilometer in 15 seconds. The U-boat's greatest tactical advantage, its ability to operate invisible on the surface at night, had been eliminated. German commanders didn't understand this. They couldn't understand it because they had no information suggesting such technology existed. The Metox receivers confirmed what German intelligence believed. British radar operated on 1.5 meter wavelength, detectable at long range, giving submarines adequate warning to dive. Except British radar no longer operated solely on 1.5 meter wavelength. On May 11th, Convoy HX 237 came under attack. 12 U-boats converged on the convoy. They sank 3 merchant ships. 5 submarines were destroyed. 3 more were damaged. 8 U-boats out of 12. 67% casualties. The mathematics were becoming undeniable. U-boats were being destroyed faster than they could sink Allied shipping. The fundamental equation of the Battle of the Atlantic had reversed. Admiral Dönitz convened an emergency conference at U-boat headquarters on May 14th. He assembled his staff officers, senior engineering advisors, and intelligence specialists. The question was simple. What had changed in Allied anti-submarine warfare that was causing these catastrophic losses? The intelligence staff presented their analysis. Allied escort forces had increased in number and capability. More destroyers, more corvettes, more frigates equipped with better sonar and more depth charges. Allied aircraft patrols had intensified. Long-range B-24 Liberator bombers were closing the mid-Atlantic air gap, the area beyond aircraft range, where U-boats had previously operated safely. Allied training had improved. Escort commanders were coordinating attacks more effectively. Radio direction finding had become more accurate, allowing escorts to locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. All of these factors were true, but they didn't fully explain losses on the scale Germany was experiencing. Dönitz turned to his engineering staff. Was there any possibility the British had developed new radar technology? The chief engineer explained the technical constraints. Centimetric radar would require generating high power at wavelengths shorter than 1 meter. Current vacuum tube technology couldn't achieve this. The power output would be insufficient for operational detection ranges, even if the British had somehow solved the power generation problem. Centimetric radar would have other limitations. Antenna size, weight, mechanical complexity. These factors made centimetric airborne radar impractical with current technology. The chief engineer's assessment was clear. Centimetric radar was theoretically possible, but operationally improbable. British engineers faced the same physical constraints as German engineers. If Germany couldn't build it, neither could Britain. Dönitz asked about the Metox receiver failures. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engineering staff presented test data. Every Metox unit recovered from returning U-boats had been tested. All functioned normally. All could detect 1.5-meter radar at specified ranges. There was no systemic equipment failure. The only explanation was operator error during combat stress. But Dönitz knew his commanders. He knew his crews. These were experienced professionals, not training school graduates on their first patrol. They didn't make consistent, repeated operator errors across dozens of separate incidents. There had to be another explanation. Then, someone mentioned a rumor. Several returning commanders had reported that captured British aircrew, during interrogation, had mentioned that Coastal Command was homing in on radiation emitted by Metox receivers themselves. Super heterodyne receivers emit weak signals on their intermediate frequency. British aircraft had supposedly developed direction-finding equipment sensitive enough to detect those emissions at 90 kilometers. The story sounded plausible. German engineers confirmed that Metox receivers did emit detectable signals on their intermediate frequency of 455 kilohertz. The emissions could be detected at 2 kilometers with specialized equipment. But could the British have developed airborne direction finders sensitive enough to detect them from 90 kilometers? Engineers ran calculations. It would require receiver sensitivity 50 decibels, better than anything currently available. It would require large directional antennas, several meters in size. Such equipment would be too heavy and bulky for patrol aircraft. The physics didn't support the claim, but the alternative was even less believable. If the British weren't detecting Metox emissions, they must have developed completely new radar on frequencies Metox couldn't receive. That would mean wavelengths shorter than 60 centimeters. German research had concluded years ago that such wavelengths were impractical. The intelligence staff faced an impossible choice: accept that the British had achieved a breakthrough German science said was impossible, or accept that British aircraft were detecting Metox through methods German engineers said were improbable. Both seemed equally unlikely. But U-boats were dying at unprecedented rates, and headquarters needed to give commanders operational guidance. The decision was made to assume the Metox emission story was true. It fit known physics. It could be tested. It could be countered by shutting off the receivers. The alternative, accepting that British radar technology was years ahead of German capabilities, was too disturbing. It would mean fundamental assumptions guiding German military technology were wrong. It would mean 3 years of successful U-boat operations had been based on tactical doctrines that were suddenly obsolete. That was too large a paradigm shift to make based on incomplete information. On May 15th, additional convoy battles confirmed the crisis. Convoy SC-130 was attacked by 11 U-boats. They sank 2 merchant ships. 4 submarines were destroyed. 3 more were damaged so severely they aborted their patrols. 7 U-boats out of 11, 64% casualties for 2 merchant ships. The following day, Convoy HX-238 came under attack. 9 U-boats converged. They sank 1 merchant ship. 33 submarines were destroyed. 2 were damaged. 5 out of 9, 56% casualties for 1 merchant ship sunk. The pattern was consistent across every convoy engagement in mid-May. U-boats were achieving minimal success while suffering catastrophic losses. Experienced commanders were being killed. Boats were being destroyed faster than shipyards could replace them. More critically, the institutional knowledge of the U-boat force was being eliminated. Experienced commanders like Werner Henke understood submarine warfare in ways that couldn't be taught in training schools. They knew how to read tactical situations. They knew when to attack and when to evade. They knew how to survive. New commanders, fresh from U-boat school at Gotenhafen, were technically proficient but had no combat instincts. They followed doctrine that no longer worked. They made decisions based on assumptions that were no longer valid, and they died. On May 19th, the crisis became personal for Admiral Dönitz. His son, Peter Dönitz, was serving as watch officer on U-954, part of a wolf pack assigned to attack convoy SC-130. Peter was 21 years old, recently promoted to Oberleutnant zur See. At 1400 hours, U-954 was detected by British escort frigate HMS Leone. The escort attacked with depth charges. The submarine was driven to the surface by damage. When U-954 surfaced, Leone opened fire with 4-inch guns. The submarine's pressure hull was riddled. She sank within minutes. There were no survivors. When news reached Admiral Dönitz on May 21st, he ordered an immediate comprehensive review of all U-boat operations. The staff presented statistics that were devastating beyond any previous naval defeat Germany had suffered. In May alone, through May 21st, 38 U-boats had been lost. That represented 24% of the operational submarine force. Another 34 boats were damaged, some so severely they would be out of service for months. In exchange for these losses, U-boats had sunk 41 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic during May, 41 ships for 38 submarines destroyed and 34 damaged. The mathematics were catastrophic. German shipyards could eventually replace lost submarines. Production was running at 20 boats per month, but replacing experienced crews was impossible. Most commanders killed in May were combat veterans with multiple successful patrols. Their knowledge, their tactical expertise, their ability to make split-second decisions under pressure couldn't be replicated by fresh academy graduates. The U-boat force was losing its institutional memory faster than it could be replaced. Admiral Dönitz spent May 22nd and 23rd in meetings with his senior staff. They reviewed every action report from the month. They analyzed loss patterns. They studied tactical recommendations from surviving commanders. The conclusion was inescapable. U-boats could no longer operate effectively in the North Atlantic convoy routes. Allied detection capability, whatever its source, had rendered German submarine tactics obsolete. Continuing to send U-boats into the Atlantic was simply throwing away crews and boats for negligible gain. On May 24th, 1943, Admiral Dönitz made the most difficult decision of his career. He drafted a signal to all U-boats operating in the Atlantic. Withdraw from convoy routes immediately, return to base, suspend all offensive operations until further notice. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Germany had lost. In his war diary entry for May 24th, Dönitz wrote, "We are at present facing the greatest crisis in submarine warfare since the enemy has made fighting impossible. The enemy has rendered the U-boat ineffective through new location devices. He didn't know what those devices were. He didn't know how they worked. He didn't know how to counter them. All he knew was that submarines couldn't operate effectively anymore. The withdrawal order marked the end of the U-boat offensive that had nearly starved Britain into submission. For 3.5 years, German submarines had terrorized Atlantic convoy routes. They had sunk over 2,300 Allied merchant ships, totaling more than 11 million tons. They had killed 30,000 merchant seamen. And it had been stopped by 10-centimeter radar the Germans didn't know existed. The truth began emerging slowly over the following months. In late May, several U-boat commanders reported detecting unusual radar signals on frequencies their Metox receivers couldn't process. These reports were inconsistent and difficult to verify. The signals appeared intermittently and couldn't be reliably reproduced. German engineers began investigating whether British radar had indeed shifted to shorter wavelengths. But without captured equipment or detailed intelligence, they were working blind. In June 1943, a British aircraft was shot down over occupied France. The wreckage was recovered and examined by German technical intelligence. Among the debris, engineers found components from an ASV Mark III radar system. The magnetron was damaged but identifiable. German radar specialists analyzed the device. They determined it was designed to operate at approximately 10-centimeter wavelength. The power output, based on component specifications, was far higher than German engineers had thought possible for such a small device. This was the first concrete evidence that British centimetric radar existed and was operational, but it came too late. By June, the U-boat offensive in the Atlantic had already collapsed. Withdrawing submarines from convoy routes and developing countermeasures would take months. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently to the Allies. On August 3rd, 1943, Admiral Dönitz issued an emergency order based on the Metox emission theory that still persisted. All U-boats at sea were to shut off Metox receivers immediately. It was better to operate without radar warning than to broadcast position to every British aircraft within 100 kilometers. What Dönitz didn't know was that the Metox emission story was deliberate disinformation. British intelligence had prepared the cover story specifically to protect the ASV Mark III secret. Captured aircrews had been briefed before every patrol on what to say if interrogated. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence verified that Metox emissions were technically detectable. They never suspected the real answer was radar operating on frequencies their receivers couldn't detect. The cruel irony was that shutting off Metox made submarines more vulnerable. The old 1.5-meter ASV Mark I was still used on many British aircraft. Metox could detect that system. With receivers shut off, U-boats were blind to both old and new radar. The August order increased losses instead of reducing them. By September 1943, Telefunken delivered the first Naxos radar warning receivers to U-boat bases. Naxos could detect centimetric radar. It operated between 2,500 and 3,750 megahertz, covering the 10-centimeter band British ASV Mark III was using. Finally, German submarines had a way to detect the radar that had been killing them for 5 months. But it was too late. By September, Allied anti-submarine forces had grown so powerful that even with radar warning, U-boats couldn't operate safely. Very long range. B-24 Liberator bombers had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers provided continuous air cover over convoys. Hunter-killer groups with the latest sonar and radar actively sought submarines instead of just defending merchants. Allied shipyards were launching new vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. The strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. Naxos revealed what had been killing U-boats, but knowing the threat didn't provide an effective counter. The receivers suffered from false alarms. Their sensitivity made them pick up signals from ships and aircraft too far away to be immediate threats, causing unnecessary dives that wasted precious battery power. Many commanders found Naxos almost as frustrating as having no warning system. German forces tried to adapt. They developed new tactics for operating under constant surveillance. They equipped submarines with more anti-aircraft guns and ordered them to fight on the surface when attacked instead of diving. That led to disasters. British aircraft were heavily armed and could destroy submarine gun crews from outside their effective range. They tried moving operations to different areas. Submarines were sent to the Indian Ocean, South Atlantic, Caribbean, anywhere convoys might be less protected. But Allies had centimetric radar everywhere. ASV Mark III and American equivalents were standard equipment on maritime patrol aircraft worldwide. By late 1943, there was nowhere to hide. The fundamental problem was that submarines had lost their primary advantage. For 3 years, U-boats had operated on the surface at night, invisible to Allied radar, faster than escort ships, able to position for attacks. That advantage was gone. Centimetric radar could detect surfaced submarines at night as easily as in daylight. U-boats were forced to operate submerged for most of their patrols, which cut speed from 17 knots to 7, reduced operational range by half, and made it nearly impossible to intercept fast convoys. Battery endurance became the critical limitation. Type 7C submarines carried 2 banks of 62 cell batteries. At maximum submerged speed of 7.6 knots, batteries exhausted in 90 minutes. At economical speed of 4 knots, endurance extended to 80 hours. But 80 hours submerged meant 80 hours of limited mobility, no ventilation, no battery charging, no opportunity to attack. When batteries exhausted, submarines had to surface and run diesel engines to recharge, taking 4 to 6 hours. During that time, they were vulnerable to radar detection. The cycle became self-reinforcing. Submarines stayed submerged to avoid radar. Staying submerged exhausted batteries. Surfacing to recharge exposed them to radar. Diving to evade aircraft used more battery power. Boats were spending more time hiding and less time hunting. Patrol effectiveness dropped by more than half. By end of 1943, U-boat operations had become suicide missions. New submarines were sent into the Atlantic with inexperienced crews who had no idea how to fight Allied technological superiority. Loss rates climbed above 50%. Some boats were sunk on their first patrol before reaching operational areas. The average lifespan of a U-boat in the Atlantic had dropped to less than 3 months. For comparison, average lifespan in 1942 had been over a year. Werner Henke survived until April 9th, 1944, when U-515 was sunk by American destroyers and aircraft from USS Guadalcanal. 16 crew members were killed. 44 survived, including Henke. He was taken prisoner and transferred to Fort Hunt, Virginia, for interrogation. On June 15, 1944, Henke was shot and killed while attempting to escape from the interrogation facility. He was 35 years old. The ASV Mark III remained classified until after the war. German intelligence never fully understood what happened during May 1943. They knew British forces had developed centimetric radar. They knew it operated on 10-centimeter wavelength, but they never realized how early it had been deployed or how completely it had changed the tactical situation. German records from May 1943 are filled with references to unknown Allied detection methods and mysterious location equipment. The confusion was genuine. Without access to the technology or detailed intelligence about its capabilities, German commanders were fighting an enemy they couldn't understand. British Coastal Command eventually published statistics on ASV Mark III effectiveness. From March through July 1943, aircraft with the new radar sank 37 U-boats and seriously damaged 49 others. That represented over half of all U-boat losses during that period. Most attacks came without warning. Crews who survived reported that radar detectors gave no indication of approaching aircraft until too late to dive. Germans eventually developed their own centimetric radar. The Berlin series, based on a captured British magnetron, recovered from a downed bomber in February 1943, entered service on U-boats in late 1944. But by then, the Battle of the Atlantic was long over. Submarines, equipped with Berlin radar, were mostly used for the weather reporting and transportation missions, not convoy attacks. The technology came too late to change anything. Admiral Dönitz remained convinced throughout the war that a combination of factors had defeated his U-boats in May 1943. Better Allied training, improved tactics, more escort ships and aircraft, closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, better sonar and depth charges. He knew centimetric radar was part of the answer, but never fully grasped how decisive it had been. He thought it was one element among many. He didn't realize it was the primary factor that had rendered his entire tactical doctrine obsolete overnight. The final statistics tell the story. In March 1943, U-boats sank 82 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. They lost 12 submarines, a ratio of almost 7-to-1 in Germany's favor. In April, they sank 39 ships and lost 15 boats. The ratio dropped to about 2.5-to-1. In May, they sank 34 ships and lost 41 submarines. The ratio had reversed For every merchant sunk, Germany lost more than one submarine. After May, the ratio never again favored U-boats. By end of 1943, it took more than 3 submarine patrols to sink a single merchant ship. By 1944, it was closer to 5 patrols per sinking. The U-boat force kept fighting until the end of the war, but never again threatened Allied convoy routes. The offensive capability that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic had been broken in a single month by radar operating on wavelengths German receivers couldn't detect. During those 22 days in May 1943, from May 1st, when the losses became undeniable, to May 24th, when Dönitz ordered the withdrawal, 41 German submarines were destroyed. 41 boats with experienced crews, carrying the institutional knowledge of 3 years of successful warfare. They were killed by technology they didn't know existed, fighting an enemy they couldn't see, defending against attacks they couldn't detect. That's how wars are won. Not through massive battles or brilliant strategies alone, but through technological advantages that one side doesn't know the other possesses. SV Mark III wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a modest improvement over existing radar technology made possible by a new type of vacuum tube that could generate shorter wavelengths, but deployed at the right moment against an enemy who didn't know it existed. That modest improvement changed the course of the war. The cavity magnetron weighed 400 grams, a copper cylinder 8 centimeters tall, and it broke the back of Germany's submarine offensive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.